Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ancient and Modern. Today I have a very special guest, and this is Hugh Pope, who is, I have to introduce you this way, I'm afraid. You are the son of Maurice Pope, and the reason I introduce you that way is because you've published and edited this marvelous book, The Keys to Democracy, by your father. I should note you're also a distinguished journalist. Do you want to talk a little bit about your career and how you got to edit this book of your father's?
Well, I obviously had to go one further than my father. My father was all about ancient Greece, so I went on to Syria, and I eventually became a journalist for 30 years in the Middle East, and lived in Istanbul for a very long time. Uh, Reported on lots of very badly run countries, 30 or so by my count. And by the time I'd finished up, I was an analyst and advocate for peace with the International Crisis Group. And all this brought me a lot into contact with governments that were either completely divorced from their electorate and pretending to be elected, or were just enthralled to what they thought their electorate wanted, for instance, in Cyprus. And it became more and more frustrating to me that when we were trying to do anything, we would run up against this thing. We can't do this because the electorate won't wear it, or I don't care what the electorate says anyway. So I sort of began to view the whole electoral system as very corrupt and unrepresentative of what people really wanted. But I didn't, even though I had read my father's book in the 1980s, because it was my dad, I guess we never really pay attention to what I hadn't really clocked how radical what he was proposing was. And so it was when I read a book by David van Reybrouck called Against Elections that the lights went on for me. Literally, I thought, well, this man's got it. He understands it. Um, and at that time, my father was still alive, and I actually did go back to him and said, "Dad, where is your book again?" Because it was lost; no one could find it. And indeed, he still couldn't find it. He didn't know where it was. He thought it was in his computer, but it was just a jumble of corrupt files. So we gave up. And but then after he died, my mum found the book in TypeScript on in his library, and I took it from there.
So he couldn't get it published during his lifetime, right? So at the time, people seem to have just thought this is crazy. And it's interesting because now, of course, there's this big boom in sortition studies and people doing citizens' assemblies and things like that, right?
He did send it to be published by his non-publisher. He was quite uh, well published person. I mean, his books were translated in several languages and praised and everything. But this one was off his beaten path, and he wasn't actually working for in a university job at the time. And he got back. I later discovered, so I'm going through his papers right now because the University of Cambridge is taking them all for their archive. And I discovered two readers' reports of it from the 1980s. And actually, they're quite positive. They said, yes, obviously I'll need to edit this, but this is unusual. I think it's something that needs to be said, could do well, this sort of thing. But for whatever reason, the publishers decided not to go ahead, and I don't even know which publishers it were. I think Faber was one of them, but I think it went to a couple of places. But then my father gave up hope. Yeah. So he just felt that if a publisher wasn't ready to commit, he wasn't ready to commit the time to updating it, because obviously it was a lot of work for him. I mean, it was all very well him knowing all about classical Greece, but to catch up with several centuries of political science studies, even for a man who loved to be a brilliant amateur as he did, I think it was quite an effort.
All right, so we heard a bit about how you got into the topic of sortition. My sense of how your father got into the topic of sortition was that he was studying ancient Greek at Sherborne School in Dorset, which is quite a conservative public school. And it just so happens that we both also went to Sherborne School. I studied Greek at Sherborne School. That's where I got into Greek, well, Latin and Greek. And then I started thinking when I learned about the Athenian system, oh, this is actually kind of an interesting system. I wonder if would work in the modern day. That ended up for me with a PhD on Athenian democracy at Stanford University with Josiah Ober, who's one of the great scholars of ancient and modern democracy. So I guess my question is that also something that influenced you? Were you forced to do Greek or at least Latin at Sherborne? And did you start sort of matching that up with the things that your father was saying at home?
I did indeed do Latin and Greek at Sherborne. However, was completely hopeless at it. My subject was English, and that's where I enjoyed it. I think because the teachers were good, and I think it was the same for my father at Sherborne. Is that the two teachers that influenced him that he looked up to most? Uh, there was A.B. Gourley, the house tutor of Schoolhouse. I don't know which house you were in, James, but
Ambulance, yeah, very important
yeah,
place.
very important at Sherborne. Yes. Anyway, he was at the big house at Schoolhouse, and his house tutor, A.B. Gourley, was uh, a very clever Greek scholar, and the headmaster, Ross Wallace, who was known as Chief. Who clearly, I read through the reports that going through all these documents of his, they loved him and he loved them. And he wrote about how they had influenced him and things like, I mean, they used to do things that no one would do today, which is they would encourage people to learn their Latin verse off by heart. One of his teachers at Sherborne even offered him sixpence for every 6 lines of Latin verse that he wrote himself. And I eventually had to limit him to one set of 6 verses per day because my father was so fluent at it. And I think that the fact is that he spent 4 years at Sherborne with excellent masters who schooled him in a very rigorous approach to classical education, and I think that's what set him up for life. And they knew they were doing it too. When I read all their comments, is that they were preparing him for a life of scholarship.
So, what do you think they would have made of his more radical take on the nature of democracy then, and his, utopia where there are no elections even? It's all just everyone's just selected by lot. Because Sherborne's quite a conservative school.
Well, and when I was there in the 1970s, it was positively anti-intellectual. You sort of more had to furtively slip into the library if you wanted to do any reading because people really frowned on it, at least in the schoolboy system. And it was remarkable how the boys were separate from the masters. Anyway, but I think the masters would not have been surprised if you reading what they said. They would say things like. Promisingly free from the dead hand of literalness or reading outside the conventional limits of a school syllabus and shows, yeah, they accused him of wild guesses sometimes. I suppose some people might say that sortition is a wild guess, but definitely I think there was something also that he shared with you is that he took very literally what he read about the Greeks, and I think that from the very beginning, he felt that the Greeks were one of the most civilized places on the planet ever, and that the reason that the Greeks gave, he knew, for their enormous achievements in civilization and tragedy, comedy, philosophy, mathematics, everything, was attributed by the Greeks themselves to their form of democracy. So I think he just thought that 2 + 2 is 4. This works, and I think he always believed it.
You reminded me of something there, though, that I think that, it was a conservative atmosphere at Sherborne, but there was also this very English tradition of eccentricity. In a way, a lot of the masters were sort of liberal in that sense. They wanted you to explore ideas and to make, unexpected combinations of ideas and things like that.
Yeah, well, they didn't like. I mean, I think I was nearly expelled, so I think that my combination of ideas was not appreciated. But I did get the chance to run an underground newspaper on the headmaster's Roneo stencil machine with my friend Nick Thorpe, who's now the BBC's head man in East Europe.
All right.
Which is,
You took it
yeah.
too far and you were ostracized, to borrow another Athenian institution.
Yeah, because I smoked and drank and was very naughty.
Oh
Point was
dear. Oh dear.
stopped immediately. I left school.
Well, okay. So going back to politics, I mean, I note in my review of your father's book that he makes several remarks that would probably not endear him to dogmatists of the right or the left, these sort of asides. Um, and so he obviously had this very solidly conservative, background in a traditional classical education. But I was having a hard time sort of getting a sense of his politics. I mean, maybe they were just very heterodox. So, what sort of a man was he politically? Did he move from conservative background to more progressive opinions in life, or was he just sort of all over the place in an interesting way?
Oh, he was definitely not all over the place. No, no, he was highly principled to his own detriment. I mean, to his personal. I mean, in 1969, when he had an immensely successful career in the University of Cape Town as professor of classics, dean of the Department of Arts and sorry, the Faculty of Arts. Um, the university withdrew the offer of a job to an African who'd been offered the senior lectureship in African studies. And my father immediately resigned without saying anything to anybody. But he resigned. He didn't have another job. He hadn't prepared his way anyway. He just left. And it came to light 6 months later. And it came into the press then. But at the time, he did it out of principle. So that was definitely an approach he had. Very nonconformist. For instance, he was very proud of having written a letter to the Times when the Rolling Stones were thrown in jail for smoking weed and defending the Rolling Stones on the basis of what actually turned into an opinion piece by the editor of the Times. Who knows where the editor of the Times got his ideas from? But my father certainly had written to him beforehand. And wasn't published. The other thing I'd say is he abhorred hypocrisy. He would sit at the end of the dining table, ridiculing government for hypocritical acts. So I was brought up basically believing that all government was a terrible sin, which I think was completely wrong because, of course, you don't get the context when you have someone like your father, my father, sitting at the end of the table who had a photographic memory for everything. He could recite whole books of Virgil. I mean, it was ridiculous. He knew things effortlessly, which the rest of us, have to sort of read for weeks and weeks. And so I didn't know the context, but yeah, so he was a politically liberal Democrat in the sense that he would support them in the electoral system, as far as I remember. But that sort of faded away, and then he lost interest, especially after he wrote the Keys to Democracy. I don't think we heard much more about. He briefly supported proportional representation as well, but again, that fell away.
It's interesting that he was so cynical about government, actually, because it's hard to say with Sortition, with his sort of utopia where everybody's allotted, or even with classical Athens, actually, is that big government or is it small government? Because in one sense, it's big government because they have a lot of institutions, a lot of people are paid to be magistrates. But in another sense, it's sort of small government because, as people often point out about classical Athens, there are no professional lawyers per se. The citizens are just allotted to be jurors, and there is bureaucracy, but often it's run by citizens. So I think one of the problems in modern states, modern representative democracies, is that you get this clear separation between the sort of elite, even though it's elected, and also civil servants, so people that are hired by the elected elite, and then the people below, and there's kind of a disconnect and there's kind of a gap there. So yeah, I don't know what he would have thought about that in terms of whether his utopia was going to be big government or small government.
I guess I was referring to my impression of him. Definitely in the Keys to Democracy, he shows that he has a very a clear division in his mind between the policy decision making and the implementation of the ideas. A very interesting division of functions in government, which he puts between, he talks about teams and policy. And for him, the teams would be the municipal councils who clean up the rubbish, and they work according to a structure, a routine, and so forth. For him, the key thing was that when you had to do things in a new way, that you shouldn't either rely on elected politicians who would be corrupt, but also not on the advice solely of experts, because in his view, experts were people who had mastered a routine and probably wouldn't want to change that routine. And he thought that the ordinary people listening to all the different experts would be much better placed to choose the new way forward for a few years if they were called in to judge the experts, as it were. So yeah, I shouldn't have made it sound like he was against all kinds of government, because
Right,
obviously the
right. Well,
man spent
that's another
spent
thing
years
which
writing a book on the perfect government. Yeah.
that distrust of experts is another thing that nowadays would be coded as right wing, right? Because I'm thinking of Michael Gove's notorious comments during the Brexit debate about we've had enough of experts. Although people often point out that's only part of the quotation. I can't remember what the full quotation is. But it seems to me that your father's view isn't so much we need to do away with experts completely, and maybe that wasn't Michael Gove's view either. But it's more sort of experts have their place in a democracy, and it might even be an honored place, but we consult them, right? We don't sort of obey them.
Exactly. That's exactly what he thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, you mentioned proportional representation. It's interesting. He talks about that a little bit in the book, and he's actually quite down on it from the point of view of sort of pure democracy. So he says that it's, quote, not a recipe for introducing democracy, but for improving oligarchy. So sometimes he takes this quite radical view that basically the whole of representative democracy is sort of corrupt. It's not really democracy. I guess kind of in my purer moments, I kind of think that too. And so for him, it's kind of like there's no point in having PR because PR just improves. It's just a sort of better version of oligarchy. We still have this elected elite, even though the elected elite are kind of more representative of the people. Um, so yeah, so it's interesting to hear you say that he actually sort of advocating in public for PR at some point.
Yes, yes, he went through yeah, a development on that because I think he does say that yes, it is marginally better, but it doesn't get to the core of the matter. And my, you know, my father was very radical, and remember, he was writing in what he believed to be a vacuum. There were other people working on this thing, but none of them knew about each other very much. It's extraordinary that in the pre-internet days, how people could be fairly isolated. But yeah, he believed in takeover of all the branches of government by permanent, randomly selected panels, as he called them. We call them now citizens' assemblies. And he wrote it obviously in the 1970s. But now, even now, there are books coming onto the market that are also going all the way. Like, for instance, Lotocracy by Alexander Guerreros is, I haven't finished reading it yet, but he is a complete lotocrat, as it were. And there are others who suggest there are a couple of other books which come very close to it, which is quite new because people were a bit nervous about voicing this radicalism because it might put them outside the pale, as it were, and that you know if it's almost like people are scared, and I come across it in my own work, doing sort of helping out in the sortition scene here in Europe, that there are definitely a kind of organization that is taking money from governments that doesn't want to hear this radical position because they fear that it'll scare the horses and make the money go away, I think. But also
Yeah.
maybe to be fair, they may also feel that it's the time is not yet ripe. And obviously the citizenry hasn't heard of sortition yet. So how are they going to get behind a system that's completely run on sortition on the
Yeah.
basis?
Well, I mean, I do like sortition an awful lot, and I think it should be used more. But I'm kind of a gradualist as well. Like I agree with Karl Popper that we should do sort of piecemeal social engineering because you never know what might go wrong, right? I'm not really a fan of sort of huge revolutions. So I don't know. Did your father talk about this as well? Like when he was talking at the dinner table, was he sort of a fiery revolutionary, or would he have been in favor? For example, I think it's the Sortition Foundation, which has recently run a campaign for allotting the House of Lords. So that's kind of like a
Yeah.
halfway step, right? I might even be more of a gradualist than them. Like I might even say, let's just allot half of the House of Lords for 5 or 10 years and then see how it goes. I think it would probably go quite well, and then maybe we could move to allotting the whole of the Lords. But so a lot of people I think do take this more gradualist approach where it's like, let's start with a few institutions. We'll keep the elected sort of representative democratic structure in place for a while. So yeah, how did he talk about it?
He was a visionary type. He wasn't the revolutionary plotting behind the scenes, organizing his network, lining up his men and ladies to achieve some sort of revolutionary goal. No, he genuinely believed that this is how it should all end up. How it would get there. He does have a last chapter in the book which looked at things from through the lens of the 1980s, and you can see that he saw a gradual progression of places in the media in certain areas of life that would be particularly open or where it might be easier to introduce the idea, but he would never have shied away from his ultimate aim, which would be in 100 years' time that we should have a society run along these lines. They I mean, I think the example he gives in the books is, in the book, is when the Chartists in the middle of the 19th century were seeking a bit more representation, or and if you told them that in 60 years' time there would be universal suffrage, which they did, they did want, they wouldn't have believed it. No one would have believed it, but it happened anyway. I mean, that was the way things went. As the vote expanded. I mean, I think in Britain we still had rotten boroughs until the middle of the 20th century. I mean, there was all kinds of weird survivals. I mean, not only the 800 members of the House of Lords. Uh,
Yeah, that's
anyway,
right. No, and I can remember actually at Sherborne, they had an old boy come back and speak. I think he was the Earl of Oxford. Is that possible? Yeah, but because I think also he was Oxfordian. And he thought that Shakespeare's works were written by a previous Earl of Oxford. And he was one of these guys who, when Tony Blair tried to reform the Lords and did actually in the end reform the Lords slightly, he stood up in the Lords and said, in defense of hereditary peers, which is kind of funny. That sort of illustrates the contrast I'm thinking about between quite conservative school and then Sortition. Um, so let's go back to this vision. So his vision is of an entirely sortative utopia. And in the book, another thing I really like is kind of a personal connection, is that this utopia is set in a post-apocalyptic New Zealand. I'm in New Zealand. I'm in this New Zealand Initiative think tank, by the way, where I work. So here's some of our reports behind us. We don't have one on making New Zealand into a sortative utopia yet, but just thinking about his sortative utopia, I mean, I guess I would be maybe even more of a gradualist than he was. But also, I'm not even sure if I am in 100% with the ideal of everything is just sortition, because even as a Democrat, and still quite a radical Democrat, it strikes me that there are other modalities, there are other ways of doing democracy that we might profitably combine. So, for example, referenda, I think, can be quite useful because what you have there is people voting directly on certain issues. Um, so your father, though, was very skeptical of referenda. Actually, in the book, he's directly critical of referenda.
he is, and that's because rather like our generation as well, with Brexit and everything, referendums and potentially Scotland and England, everyone forgets that very nearly passed, which would have been even more traumatic for everybody concerned than the Brexit has proved to be. Is that he felt that it went against the fundamental philosophy of what he was advocating. I mean, the point is that you're asking the people what they think. And the whole idea behind sortition, as I understand it anyway, is that you're not just doing opinion polling, you're taking a group of people who are representative of the community or nation in which they live and educating them through that, exposing them to experts of all colors, allowing them to deliberate, to see what they all think and see what all the different perspectives of all those different people are that are in the room, and then make the proposals. And if you then hand it over to a bunch, the population as a whole, who have not been exposed to the discussions, it sort of defeats the point of it. I mean, why are you bothering to do the whole citizens' assembly thing? I mean, that would be the philosophical basis. But I completely agree that there are many ways of doing this. I mean, for instance, the Swiss are very used to taking referenda, and they're highly educated in the ways of doing it. And Oregon, for instance, has a randomly selected panel of people to write an advisory note for people when they come to vote in a referendum, so they can see what, if they want to inform themselves, they can see exactly what a non-partisan group thought should be done with this particular issue. So all of which are exciting ways of doing things that I think we can experiment with. I don't think any of us can predict how this will all work out. I don't think the perfect form of citizens' assembly has been invented yet. And I think that all kinds of different countries will probably have different ways of doing citizens' assemblies. I mean, you have countries which are much more collectivist in their approach to how they run things than in, say, the very individualistic style of the United States. So I think everywhere is going to find its own way of doing it, and we're at the very beginning of the experiment. I mean, the first citizens' assembly writ large in its modern form is only 20 years ago, and yeah, it's
Right.
we've got lots to learn, and people like my father and Alexander Guerreros, David van Raybroek, Helen Landemore, yourself, everyone writing books about it, they're just positing visions, which then people can try and
Yeah,
make work.
yeah,
And the people who are actually working in the Citizens Assembly arena are learning things every year. It's amazing. I mean, they're doing, there's all kinds of innovation happening as well.
yeah. It's very exciting and it's very visionary. I also like the aspect of it which is historical. So it's like people are having these visions of the future utopias, really. And it's sort of ideal political theory of the sort that sort of even people like Plato were involved in, right, with the Republic. And then you have this historical aspect where it's kind of like we're not only looking to the future, but in some ways we're sort of reviving some aspects of this system which flourished sort of 2,500 years ago, which is quite fun. One of the things that struck me about what you were saying, though, when you were talking about how the whole idea of sortative assemblies is that you feed people information and you make them deliberate. It's kind of a very interesting emphasis. Like, I actually think that's a very modern emphasis. I guess it sort of happened that way in Athens too, but so at Stanford, I was lucky enough to take some courses with Jim Fishkin, who designed and pioneered the deliberative poll. So these were one of the first forms of sortative assembly. And he's very big on this idea that you give people neutral, high quality information and you make them deliberate. And so a lot of that stuff comes out of the sort of theoretical movement within academia, within political theory, that democracy is fundamentally about deliberation, about a certain quality of argument. And I just wonder whether in Athens, whether they thought of it in quite that way. I mean, I think that they use sortition a lot to appoint magistrates. Now, I'm just sort of thinking out loud. I think a lot of those magistrates were appointed to boards of 10. And so I guess we can assume that there was some deliberation there. But my sense is just that they really foregrounded more the sortition than the deliberation. You know, to them, it was just a democratic principle that people should be randomly allotted. Like when you read what Aristotle says about, you know, sortition being more democratic than election, he doesn't really then go on to say, oh, because sortition allows groups of citizens to come together and discuss things. He just says, no, it's the point is random selection, right? So I wonder whether
I,
that deliberative emphasis is more of a modern thing.
it's definitely where one part of the movement is coming from. And there's also the participatory budgeting stream that has a lot to say. But having attended one or two citizens' assemblies myself, I'm with my dad in thinking that the magic the magic extra ingredient is the random selection because it has this effect on people. They are there only representing themselves. They're not, you know, I think my father would have thought that even doing stratification, that is making sure that there were exactly 50% women, 50% men, as you do it, you if you could only make it mandatory, then of course you would get the 50% naturally. You wouldn't need to go fishing for different people to represent things. And then you would have an absolutely pure thing where every single person there is just representing themselves. And the impact this has on ordinary people who've often never had their voice heard in a public policy context before. And I saw this in the convention on the end of life, Citizens Convention on the end of life in Paris, with lots of people who were literally raising their voices on a policy matter in public for the first time, but within days had got used to it. And the sense that they were equal because everyone else had also been randomly selected. There was a governor of the Bank of France, and there was a luggage handler from Charles de Gaulle. There was a grande dame with all kinds of rocks on her fingers, and a cleaning lady from a hospital. You know, but they all spoke, and it was properly facilitated to make sure that everyone's voice was heard, and it worked. But people were so empowered by being randomly selected. They even dared to challenge the president of the National Assembly of France when she came into the room, and she felt it, and she lectured them, and she said, "Now, don't you think just because you're sitting here randomly selected that you represent France? I'm elected, I represent France," and this silence descended on the room because the people were brand new to the experiment, and then they all looked at each other and they realized, actually, we are France. Those politicians in the National Assembly are all from all over the place, but they're all one kind of person. They're politicians, and so again,
Oh, that's such a fascinating moment. You know, it's a juxtaposition of the claims to legitimacy of election and sortition, right? And obviously, modern politicians are used to this idea that because they're elected, that's the source of democratic legitimacy. And I don't think, you know, there's a lot of legitimacy in elections, certainly compared to sort of directly autocratic systems. But it's just interesting because you almost hear the penny drop in that moment where the people who are randomly selected are kind of like, well, wait, this is a democratic procedure as well. It might even be superior from some points of view to election.
Yeah. And what amazed me as I stood there in this obviously very grand palatial building in Paris, the French don't do things by halves, um, was that my father had no personal knowledge of this. He was just sitting in his library in Oxford, and yet there he was writing about this feeling of liberation he described it as that people will feel when they are asked to do something for the common good. And it struck me as really remarkable that he could understand that and see that. Perhaps he got that from his brief moments of jury service where he saw people sort of deliberating for the common good. But what I think people who haven't been to a citizens' assembly underestimate is that sense of even joy, I would say. And when people feel valuable and that they're being taken seriously and that they're doing a useful job, which brings me back a bit to the referendum question, is that one of the problems that citizens' assemblies currently face is that they've now got them working quite well, but what happens after the citizens' assembly when they've made these proposals, and even if governments promise to listen to them and say exactly why they're not going to do what they were told to do, or suggested that they do. I mean, for instance, Germany has just shelved a completely doable thing on nutrition because they ran out of time at the Bundestag or something. The Convention on the End of Life, which I went to, even with the backing of Macron, he was very good about supporting them, bringing them in, empowering them, and everything, which hasn't happened anywhere else like that. Even there, we're now is it 1.5 years since the end, and it's got to be a bill in the parliament, but it's being discussed, and it's sort of, you could sort of hear the sands of time running out on it, and that's a problem for citizens' assemblies, is that if they're not taken seriously enough to actually turn into something, that's it's going to be hard for the movement to justify them in their
Yeah,
current form.
I'm just writing a piece about referenda in New Zealand actually, and there are a few cases in New Zealand where the referendum goes ahead and it reaches a certain result, but they're non-binding, so the government just sort of says tough. I think one of them was the national government, and they had a plan to sell certain state assets. There was a referendum. People said no, don't sell them. They just sort of shrugged and said, let's do it anyway. I
Mhm.
think, to be fair, I think Labour, so the other side of the aisle, also ignored a referendum. So, and that seems to happen a lot in the Citizens Assembly world, perhaps because it's still quite new. I think that the BC Citizens Assembly was a bit like that. That their proposal was just sort of not taken up. But
They
the
were given an impossible task. They were told to, yeah, they managed to get 58% of the population or the voters of BC agreed to the proposition, but the people who'd set the bar set it at 60%. So even though it was a very popular assembly and it did very well and showed that the model worked, it didn't actually get accepted because of that.
do you remember the
Uh,
details of the Irish one? Because my understanding is that there was an Irish Citizens Assembly that did actually have a sort of concrete effect on getting a gay marriage passed
yes,
in Ireland.
yeah, but there, I think possibly because it's a rare case of a citizens' assembly being given something that was actually of huge public interest. Um, Even the end of life in France, there was a bit of press coverage, but not a great deal. But I think the marriage and gay rights in Ireland were widely followed by the population. And possibly the politicians had got so scared of the population that they'd fallen behind the advances in thinking about this in Ireland. So yes, when the Citizens' Assembly recommended those constitutional changes, the referendum did pass it. And I mean the Irish experiment is the best poster child that the movement for deliberative democracy has, because it worked best there. And the the one of the difficulties of the movement is finding more examples like that, which have led to a concrete conclusion. Because even though you can see that it's working and that the proposals are good, it still has to get approved. Luckily, some places like the city of Paris now has a permanent citizens assembly as one of its houses, one of its chambers, and they are actually hardwired into the system. And there they have actually had a bill that went through the whole Citizens Assembly process and passed. And so it is now part of the legislative. It's passed a legislative test, as it were. So these things are happening there, and I, there are great leaps forward and disappointments, but it's all new, and that's very exciting, as you said.
Yeah, so I actually have never taken part of one sort of in the flesh. I mean, I've seen videos about them, I've seen documentaries about them, I've read about them, but I've never actually been part of one. So, with your sort of superior experience of the practical side of this, has your experience been that when people deliberate about something, I mean, even something very kind of serious and drawing in sort of philosophical, moral, even religious issues like gay marriage or end of life, um, do they sort of all fall out and hate each other by the end of it? Do they hate each other more by the end of it after having to sort of listen to people on the other side of the aisle? Or do you get the sense that at the end of these events, there's sort of a sense of we're all together in this and we respect the other side, and even though our side didn't sort of win, we've either we've reached a compromise or we've sort of heard the arguments on the other side and we respect the process. So what's the sort of emotional tenor of these events?
The short story is it's a remarkable tool for depolarization. For instance, I work a little bit for Democracy Next, an NGO here. It was a global NGO that, and we had a role in catalyzing uh, a civic. It was called a civic assembly because it was a bit smaller in a town called Bend in Oregon, and it was on youth homelessness. And Bend is one of those places in America which has the town is mainly blue and the countryside is red. It's sort of more Republican and the town is more Democrat. And the Citizen Assembly had both sides. And as you know, in America, it's incredibly polarized. Now, the two sides can barely talk to each other. This is as bad as Brexit and anti-Brexit and so forth. And the theme that comes through everyone who reported on it. It's a lovely story in the New Yorker. There are videos about it. Is how people just set these things aside. Once they got to start talking to each other, they found many more things in common than they did that separated them, and they were ready to work towards a common goal. And in nearly all of the citizens' assemblies, to give you an idea, and you know, we're very familiar with populations very often split one third radically against this, one third radically for it, and the middle people in the middle not knowing quite what to do. But in citizens' assemblies, almost always the proposals are made with 60, 70, 80% of the people voting. So it's not full consensus, but it's very close to consensus. And my experience of watching people at it is that they very rarely raise their voices. One of the first things you agree when you come to citizens' assembly is a kind of code of conduct, and as we know, aggression is often caused by fear, and if no one is aggressing you or you've been made to feel safe, then you're not going to be aggressive yourself. So the tenor is wonderful. In fact, David van Raybroek, the sort of patron saint of the modern citizens' assemblies, he talks about the buzz of a citizens' assembly, of people talking, and it is a remarkable sound. It makes you, it still makes my the hair stand on end because it is so beautiful to hear people getting on and getting and making sense together of a difficult problem, but finding ways to fix it, and each bringing their own particular point of view and refining things so that no one is offended and that it summarizes what everyone's thinking at that time. Yeah, in 10 years' time, maybe there'll need to be a new citizens' assembly on the end of life. I mean, no law should be forever, but it was a truly beautiful experience.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you had Gaullist and probably people who support Melanchthon, far right, far left, and lots of people in the middle, as there should be. Sometimes I get slightly worried about the sortition movement because I sort of look at a lot of the topics that they're raising and the people who are doing them, and they do seem to be drawn from a certain segment of the academic elite, maybe the political elite. And for that reason, maybe do they have some kind of a left-wing bias now, in a way that maybe referenda now become like a right-wing thing or they become coded as right. Sortition is almost like too progressive, even though deep down I sort of think that, and I was talking a little bit about the contrast between your father's conservative background and the sortition movement. But I think deep down, sortition and direct democracy, they're neither left or right wing, right? They're just about how you sort of set up the conversation. So I should say as well, when I was at Stanford and I took these courses with Jim Fishkin, Jim Fishkin's a great guy, good man, good scholar, but I kind of got the sense that he sort of he often seemed to sort of approve of the fact that the opinions of the masses that were drawn together in sortition were moving in a particular direction. The high quality information often seemed to move them in a more liberal direction. I mean, we all have biases and stuff. To some extent, that's kind of inevitable that we'll think, these people are moving in the right direction if it's more likely to be yours. But is this a concern that you share? Do you think the sortition movement is too likely to be drawn from a certain political angle?
Well, definitely the people involved are from the elite, yes. But I don't view this as some kind of neo-colonial project because, frankly, our city, our democracies are in total crisis. I live here in Belgium. We had 250 days where they couldn't agree a government. The city of Brussels, federal state of Brussels in Belgium, still can't make a government because of the selfishness of the politicians. And the same things are happening in Germany, in Holland, in France, in Britain, where I'm originally from. The country was run by someone who made who deliberately acted the clown. And it is, I think it's normal that the elites in these countries should try and find ways to reconnect government with people. And I'm very inspired by the work's being done. I don't think we've got anything to teach anyone outside our countries at the moment. I mean, if people want to take ideas from us, at Democracy Next, for instance, we're doing things in the Gambia if we can find the money after Trump cut it all off. But anyway, we do have plans for doing it, and the people in Kerawan in the Gambia are very, very interested in doing it, and would, if they could only raise the money themselves, they would and do it. I mean, it's quite expensive doing citizens' assemblies. I mean, for instance, the one I was at in France cost 4.5–5 million euros. I think it was good value for a country as big as France, and one that I worked it out for the next 10 years. It would be €1 for every person who died in France, to have the choices that are being discussed, which I think is a good investment. But go back to the elite part. I think the one place where there is criticism, usually from the right wing, of citizens' assemblies, is the question of who's organizing them, and are they choosing experts who will guide the assembly to a certain result? And this is, I think, a valid fear because, yeah, tends to be progressive people who do it. But having watched citizens' assemblies in action, first of all, it's there were 60 experts called to the one in Paris, and a remarkable array of people. But even when you have less, it's very difficult to hide things from people. And most citizens' assemblies have a segment where the citizens themselves are asked, is there anyone you want to see? And for instance, in France, the citizens said, yes, we want to go and visit palliative care centers. We want to visit people who are dying. We want to interview people who have decided to take their own lives. And they forced it on the organizers, and that should be, and normally is, a way of making sure that the direction of flow of a citizens' assembly is not manipulated by anybody, which it absolutely shouldn't be, and there should be guardrails for it, and it should all be absolutely transparent.
Right. So one of the things you mentioned a while back actually was this idea of stratified sampling. So my understanding now is that when they do citizens assemblies, they try and make it representative in a demographic sense to make sure they have the right number of ethnic minorities and women. And I think stratified sampling basically works by saying we're going to have a certain percentage of, say, Canadians in this group of people, and then we're going, you have a certain percentage of Canadians, and then we're going to allot Canadians into that. So you have allotment still, but you make sure that there's a certain number of each demographic group. Your father actually in the book came up with, again, you said that he was kind of doing this on his own. He came up with this very kind of, well, looks like a very original way of doing it, where he's trying to make sure that you're kind of 99% certain statistically that you get a representation of certain minorities just by allotting a certain number of people. So, I put in my review a formula for how you actually do this, but it's actually not that complicated statistically. I think I had a talented student who actually worked it out for me. She didn't want to be named, but put that in the article. So
A bit, yeah.
yeah, so it's a bit of a complicated way of doing it, but you can work out a number. So you say we have to have at least 1,403 people in this sortative body if we want to guarantee that each of sort of 7 subdivisions of the citizenry are going to be represented. So yeah, you think he would be if he was still around today and he went to one of these citizens' assemblies and someone said, "Oh, look, the way we do it now is just the stratified sampling." Do you think he would have been satisfied with that?
No, no, he would have wanted it to be mandatory, like jury service in Anglo-Saxon countries. That would be the way to ensure that you had the best possible representation. And in Europe, there are groups that are trying to get the representativity of the initial sample up, because that's the best sample. Because the problem is that currently, because citizens' assemblies are little known, people are having to do it on their weekends. It's very difficult for people with families or shift work or whatever. They're only getting about 5% of the people, if they're lucky. 5% of people are responding positively to the initial mailing, mail shot or phone call. So there are thousands of phone calls going out, 5% come back, and then normally about 6 criteria are applied in this process, as you said, called stratification: age, location, education. They have some way of measuring socioeconomic status, and gender they usually add in, and there's one other, but so these criteria are used to make new pots, which are again randomly selected, and they have a very sophisticated way of doing it now, where they generate multiple versions of these pots, and then they randomly choose one of them, which wouldn't be needed if you had mandatoriness. And yeah,
that mandatory thing is very radical, by the way. I mean, I kind of like it because I like the sort of many radical moments in your father's book. But of course, even in Athens, it wasn't actually mandatory. Like you had to volunteer to be allotted. And it seems like a lot of people did volunteer to be allotted in Athens, but you still had to do it. I read in another book I reviewed, an edited volume by Yves Saint-Thomas, and I think his co-editor was called Lopez Rabatal. Anyway, they have a series of essays on the history of sortition. And there's one about early modern Switzerland, where they also, was also very direct democratic culture, and Switzerland still is, where, yeah, they force everybody in the canton to be involved in sortition. And one of the problems with that apparently is that people basically want to get out of it because they haven't actually volunteered. And so there starts to be a market for people. People were basically sort of selling their place to other people because they don't want to actually be involved. And if someone else wants to be involved, they prefer to take the money or the sheep or whatever they're exchanging. So it's hard to do. I mean, I know, in Australia they have mandatory voting, and even in that case, the rates aren't 100%. They're probably like 95% or something.
yeah,
But it just seems like a tall order to sort of force everybody to be involved in politics, even though I agree that one of the big problems statistically is just that, yeah, as you say, I've actually seen figures cited that are even smaller than the one than 5%. You said 5% respond to the
That's
initial
good.
phone call.
5% is good, yeah, but it can go as low as 2%.
Yeah, and then once you get to the actual event, like the percentage of people who actually take place, I think I saw one where they had sort of 2 weekends of discussion, and the percentage of people who took part in both weekends I think was below 1%. So that's obviously a big problem for the movement, because if you're trying to make claims based on the legitimacy of this group, the democratic legitimacy of this group, and they're making decisions under this tiny slice of the population, that's a big issue. Although, of course, you might point out that if you look at the people in Westminster or in Wellington who are in Parliament as a percent, or in Ottawa, a percentage of the population, that's also a tiny sliver, right? And they're making all the decisions for us at the moment.
And do they turn up to their parliament? That's another question. But I would say one thing. I've written about three or four citizens' assemblies up close, and almost none of them have lost anybody in the process. Like the French one went on for 9 weekends over 3.5 months. They went from 185 to 184. And that one person had to go because her job insisted that she come now or lose it. They all stayed. The same thing in the Belgian one here about party political financing, and another one in Oxford that I saw. They also all stayed. Once the people have tasted it, they like it. And funnily enough, here, even here in Brussels, we have randomly selected committees vetting projects in our commune. And by an extraordinary coincidence, my wife was randomly chosen. And so once a month, she has to turn up to the local corner thing. And I think at the beginning, she resented it a bit, but she goes very willingly now. And she says the atmosphere there has only improved over time. And
Yeah.
so when, obviously, as you said, naturally, this is going to happen by evolution. Naturally, it's going to happen step by step. But and people are going to do small things as big as well as great things. And it's just that we're going to have to choose that that's where we want to put our
Yeah.
resources, get better decisions, more inclusive participation, and a sense of engagement, and an end to the way that, as my father points out in the book, all elected governments are doomed to be corrupt because you need money to get elected, and you also need a certain personality type. You need to be one of these thick-skinned, charismatic, not to say narcissistic people. You just go through the Facebook of the houses of the House of Representatives in America, and whatever color they are, wherever they come from, whatever sex they are, they all look the same. They all that bright champion smile, and not everyone's like that.
Very
And if
toothy.
you,
Yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
that's exactly what the ancient Greeks thought about elections, right? That they didn't really control for things like wealth. The Athenians were very concerned about the influence of wealth in politics, and also family background and charisma. Just natural charisma, and they wanted to actually make it genuinely democratic in the sense that the little guy, the ordinary man, would be represented. That's something that these elective systems have great difficulty doing, and we've seen a lot of countries. I mean, even in Canada, which has been relatively successful as a democracy, you get these dynasties emerge, like the Trudeaus, right? And I don't think it's incredibly sinister, but it happens in a lot of countries. You get the Bushes, you get the Clintons, and of course, you get the likes of Trump, who are just very wealthy. And I've seen the American Senate referred to as a millionaires club. So
well, it
yeah,
is more than half of them are millionaires, but they're all loyal. Also, it's not just that they're the same personality type. They all come from very similar professional backgrounds, lawyers, some businessmen, but it does not give an inclusive representation of the people they're supposed to be representing.
yeah,
Before we do all the gerrymandering and party
exactly.
political, how many people are in parties anymore? 2% around the world.
Yeah,
And of those people in the parties, how many of them are actually involved in the policy making and choosing of candidates? And there's some incredible statistic in the United States about how many constituencies the incumbent just always wins because it's
yeah, yeah.
it's it's become such a machine. And this is not what it says in the school books about,
That's right.
by
Uh,
for whatever of the people. Yes.
yeah, by the people, for the people, and of the people. I think. Yeah, is that Lincoln? I think it's
Or
Lincoln.
something.
Might be
Yes.
Jefferson. But anyway, yeah. So what you were saying before, the people love it who are involved. It's interesting because I sort of think that about the Athenians too. I mean, they had a full-on democratic system between, the reforms of Cleisthenes in 508/7 BC and all the way down to when Antipater represses the democracy in what 321 BC, and then it's arguable that even after there are kind of resurgences of democracy. And there's a great historian of Athenian democracy who died relatively recently, Peter Rhodes, who was at Durham for a long time, did a lot of really good scholarship on Athens. And there's a few articles by him where he sort of says, oh, the Athenians in the late fourth century, they kind of got a bit tired of, I think he calls it sort of just working the machine of democracy. And I actually see no evidence of that. Like, I think they were very feisty. Even after Philip of Macedon had defeated them at the Battle of Chaeronea, they, they give Demosthenes a crown. Like Demosthenes, whose policy had been, let's fight Philip and stand up for democracy. They actually give him a crown of gold. I mean, they honor this person. They put out these decrees with, iconography of democracy being crowned, or the demos, the people of Athens being crowned by the goddess Democritia. So it seems like, to the bitter end, and even beyond the bitter end, because as I say, there were democratic resurgences even in the third century BC. And so, yeah, it's like a lot of people, I think, when you talk about direct democracy, they have this Oscar Wilde, I think it was Oscar Wilde's objection to socialism that it takes up too many evenings. They say, it's just a bit of it's a bit of a fag, really. It's a bit of a drag to sort of have to go on the weekend and do stuff. But yeah, as you say, it
But
seems like often, at least again, there's sort of low rates of initial response, but at least like once people get into it and have an experience of it, they seem to actually quite enjoy it and value that as something they want to hold on to.
yeah, yeah. And there's another obstacle in people's hearts, I think, is the Renaissance obstacle of that human reason must be in charge. We have to. It must all be logical. It must be built on layers of expertise. And I think this is a really good point that my father makes: is that randomness can also be beautiful. Randomness can also be scientific. And I love his examples of that in physics. The polishing of the mirror of a telescope won't work unless it's done randomly. That the integrity of a species in biology won't work if it's not random association of all the different sexual interactions. And medicine, the artificial lining of arteries has to be done in a random pattern. Otherwise, you'll get flows that will eventually clog up too quickly. And I love finding all these places where randomness, the random selection of things, works. Like, for instance, security in airports. They use that because however good your policeman, actually, it's better to do it randomly and stop the 56th person or a random person, and then you're more likely to find the person, because obviously the people who most want to hide are going to be the best at doing it. And in some surveys, apparently the Great British Sex Survey was also done randomly and turned out to be very good. How to get research topics to get funding in Britain, I think, are also being chosen randomly now because they've just got so clogged up with their bureaucracy of choosing research topics that they decided,
Yeah.
well, once you've got to a certain level, let's just choose randomly, and apparently it's worked better. Anyway,
I think that
that,
there's still an argument for meritocracy in some of those things, but definitely I agree, and this is the note that I ended my review on. I agree that there's actually a moral force behind randomness in some situations. And it is kind of a beautiful thing because, going back to the Gaullist or the far left person in the Citizens Assembly in Paris, it's kind of like, nowadays you might think, and I'm actually very worried about Trump, partly as a Canadian. You might think, oh, there's this person in front of me who's wearing a MAGA hat and he's a terrible person and I don't want to engage with him at all. But I think the beauty of sortition is just, you have these natural inclinations and maybe you think some of them are quite right, but it sort of removes you from all that. And it's just, it sort of imposes this equality that I think is a moral principle in itself. It's sort of everyone's actually equal from that point of view, and then we can argue it out, and maybe the Trumpists will start agreeing with me more. Maybe I'll be convinced by the Trumpists. Who knows? But the sort of initial setting is just we're all human beings, or we're all citizens, and we all have something valuable to input. Even if some people know more than others, and maybe when the expert makes a presentation, we'll sort of start to think, oh, actually, he's right about this, or that, and move towards that position. But the initial condition is that we're all equals.
absolutely, and there's no monopoly on truth. None of us can ever really know what the truth is, and I think that's a very important uh, anti-Platonic note, which my father would definitely have supported. I found that even in the 50s, he was writing these diatribes against Plato and the way Plato had warped our understanding of the world, and how we should be giving more time to the Epicureans and their much more democratic approach to
Yeah,
life.
yeah. No, this is
But
also, I mean, I read Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies. Volume one is a massive diatribe against Plato when I was still at Sherborne when I was a teenager. So I have the same attitude. Actually, when I left my college at Oxford in the yearbook, the students would write basically a little blurb about their friends. And my friend wrote about me. He has a Kill Bill attitude to Plato. So,
well, my father would have loved to meet you then.
well, great, Hugh. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you continue to fight the good fight in the world of sortition.
Absolutely, and it's wonderful to see that there's a Sherburne connection through it all. And
Yep.
I enjoyed it greatly. Thank you.